couple signs of spring out there. I saw a red-winged blackbird as I drove on here at our swamp over there. That's one of my favorite birds. It makes a great sound. And I saw deer hooves in the outside garden. So I don't know if that's a sign that the deer are going to be around eating our plants this year. So that can perhaps be one of our intentions to make sure that that doesn't happen. We're Catholics, right? And Catholics believe sometimes things that seem contradictory. So we hold two things that appear to be contradictory, and we say yes to both of them. So, for example, are we saved by faith or are we saved by works? We're saved by both. We're saved by both. Is Jesus human or divine? He's both. He's both human and divine. Those two things are held together, we believe, as Catholics. And is similarly the church. Is the church human or divine? We see lots of evidence of its humanity, but is it divine? Yes. The church is human and the church is divine. One more for you. Is our prayer to God supposed to be formal or informal? It's supposed to be both. It's supposed to be both. Is our prayer supposed to be proper and respectful and meek and humble? Or is it supposed to be bold and audacious and raw and from the heart, the raw heart? Both. God desires both from us, and the both can be held together in our prayer to God. And pretty soon we'll have a beautiful altar rail here in front of us, and it will be a sign of maybe more of that formality in our prayer. That one of the reasons we're putting this up is that to help us to understand that what is behind it, what's happening behind it, especially in the tabernacle and in the Mass on the altar, is very sacred and special. And we don't want to get too casual at times with this reality that's happening. So it's there to remind us of not tread too lightly, to be respectful, to be proper, to consider and to point to Jesus and to believe that really Jesus is here in this sanctuary. But do we have the freedom to come up to that altar rail and to just say something like, come on, God, or to speak to God from our hearts and to tell him what's really, really on our heart in a very informal, audacious, perhaps bold, raw way? Yes, we do. And I'd like to speak about that aspect to our prayer this morning, because our prayer needs to have room in it for raw honesty, for informality, and for a heart-to-heart conversation with God. Because we need to remember that the primary reason, I think Father has mentioned this before, the primary reason why God has come to us in this particular way, we believe as Christians, is that God is interested in our hearts. Not simply in our obedience and in our deference to him, but he's interested in capturing our hearts. And he wants our hearts to reach out and to love him and to serve him, and therefore to be happy in union with him. So we can ask ourselves, in all my prayers that I have said recently, perhaps we have come to many masses. Perhaps we have said rosaries. Perhaps we've had morning prayers silently in our own houses. Perhaps we've gone to adoration. We can ask ourselves, has my heart been in them? Has my heart been in these prayers? Has God, when I've encountered him, heard my heart? What's really going on? Have I brought my heart to prayer? Because that is what God primarily is seeking. And the scriptures, I think, sometimes help us get in touch with our heart. Many opportunities, there's kind of a magical way that these scriptures that God has given us, they have a magical way of kind of touching our heart. So I'll give you some examples, perhaps, of the readings today. We hear the story of Emmaus. We're at the end of the story of Emmaus. The two disciples had been traveling, communicating with one another. Then someone comes up alongside Jesus and kind of surreptitiously starts talking with them, and they don't realize he's Jesus. And then later, he reveals himself as Jesus in the breaking of the bread. And perhaps we can identify with the two Emmaus disciples who communicated to Jesus in that conversation their disappointment at what had just happened in Jerusalem. Things did not go their way. And Jesus helped them to make sense out of their feelings. Jesus drew up alongside them and heard their heart. Perhaps he wouldn't have said much if they wouldn't have expressed disappointment, but it was that disappointment that elicited Jesus revealing himself, and then finally later revealing himself in the Eucharist. So don't be afraid to express disappointment in your prayer and your feelings, as the Emmaus disciples did. Or even someone consider Thomas, last week's gospel, the figure of Thomas. We're always being down on Thomas. Thomas was kind of rebuked a little bit by Jesus, perhaps. He said, "Blessed are those who haven't seen, yet believed." But it was Thomas expressing a raw feeling of, all the other disciples saw Jesus, and it's really hard for me to believe in someone I didn't see. You guys saw him, but I didn't see him, and I need to see him myself. So he expressed that raw feeling, and what happened? Jesus rebuked him a little bit, right? But then Jesus was able to show him his hands and his side. It elicited the response of Jesus, a revelation of Jesus. And perhaps we might listen to our first reading today, where the Apostle Peter, Peter does everything right? Here he is standing up, risking his life, preaching to his Jewish brethren some difficult things. And we might listen to that scripture and think to ourselves, how did he do that? Where did he get the courage? Lord, I'm too timid. I'm too scared. Yet you're asking your witnesses to have courage. Was he superhuman? Lord, give me some of that courage at home, at work, with friends. So we might ask questions like that as we encounter the scriptures, where we communicate to God with our own heart. We communicate what we're feeling. Or sometimes our prayer should include complaining, but at times our prayer will include complaining. I was complaining a little bit recently with God that, God, you have done so much in my life. So many people you have brought into my life. So many miraculous things, speakers that just inspire me. Come on, God, can't you do that to more people? Can't you give grace to more people? So I was complaining to him. Why did I get all of this? Why aren't other people seemingly, in my eyes, not receiving the graces I did? So I complained to God. I said, God, reveal yourself to more people. That's a raw feeling that I'm having in my heart. I think God appreciates what we're feeling inside, especially with our young people. I was complaining to God, our young people have so many headwinds against them in terms of receiving the faith. When we were younger, it was just easier. Things were more aligned. It was Nowadays, it's just so difficult for our young people, so many obstacles, the internet, all these things. But we can communicate spiritually to God about spiritual things in our prayer from our heart, but we can also communicate to God in our heart non-spiritual things. You know, maybe it's politics and politicians that are really bothering us. We can say something, come on, God, our country seems to be going to pot. Literally, some states are going to pot, allowing pot. It seems like the good guys are losing and the bad guys seem to be winning. The bad ideas, the bad policies. I have a good friend who's a teacher at Sibley High School. It's just unbelievable what's happening at that high school in terms of what they're requiring of their teachers to believe and communicate and no, I won't get into it. It's just, it's unbelievable. So we can complain. We can say, God, our country seems to be heading in the wrong direction. Seems like we're in a bad dream. We need your help. Help, God. Get us on the right path. So even these political feelings that we're experiencing in our hearts can be brought to prayer and laid out to God. Last Wednesday, Father gave a wonderful presentation. And he talked about receiving communion on the tongue versus on the hand. And in the context of that, he said, when we, it was men only, it was a men only night. And he said, when we install the rail, I'd like to ask the guys to, whether you're a parent or a grandparent, to bring your children up to the communion rail and teach them, tell them to be respectful, to tread lightly around the real presence, to recognize that that's Jesus up there. So tell your children, your grandchildren that. But on the other hand, we can also, at the same time as teaching our children about this respect, this great respect and love for God, we can tell our children to bring their hearts. When they come up to that communion rail and kneel down, to bring their hearts. And whatever it is that is on your heart, even if it seems perhaps a little disrespectful or out of line, if you're confused, or it might be depraved thought, God can handle it. God can receive our prayer in whatever form it takes, but he's interested in a form that arises out of our heart, and then he can work with that. So that's perhaps the message that I'd like to communicate this morning, that we as Catholics, we can have a prayer that is both informal and a prayer that is formal. And God is interested in having both of those realities of our prayer be held in constant tension into one. And I think it's out of that beautiful symphony of informality and formality in our prayer that God can really move us to the places that he wants to take us.